Hey everyone, back again. Today I want to talk about King Abdullah of Jordan's 1947 article that he had written for The American, which is a journal that no longer exists in the US, emphasizing the importance of the Palestinian struggle against Zionist terrorists at the time, like groups Irgun and Leahy, including others, and Palestinian resistance to these organizations and to broader Zionist movement and capture of Palestinian territory. Now, this text was written primarily for an American audience, hence it being written in the journal called The American. And really, the essay culminates into the following question. You, Americans, if you were living in the same situation as the Palestinians, what would you do? To which his answer is, the Palestinians would do the same. Now let's jump into the actual essay itself, because it's really brilliant. It's important to provide the historical context written in 1947, before Israel even existed, to lend credence and to be able to draw affinities between what is happening now with Israel's relentless slaughter of Palestinians and what was happening 100 years ago, and how there's a direct connection between the historical treatment of Palestinians and what we are seeing today. This is not just the product of October 7th. This has been happening for over 100 years. Now, before jumping into the actual essay itself, consider donating to one of the organizations below. It's extremely important. If your money can only go to saving a single Palestinian because of various barriers to getting that money there, then it is worth it. Then it is absolutely worth it. Consider doing so if you have the means. If you don't, help out in other ways. Follow various organizations to find out when protests are happening in your city. Show up if you are able. If you are not physically able to do these things, you can do things online. You can mount pressure. You can mount pressure against institutions to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. You can call your political leaders or email them to get them to mount pressure on arms manufacturers, on higher up political figures, on Israel itself, to end the slaughter. Now, if you're Canadian, you can go to my Instagram page where I've put a list of all Canadian MPs that you can just copy paste from the comments and then use to quickly email them. It would take you just a few minutes, and it would be quite meaningful. So please consider doing that if you have the time. Now, as far as the essay goes itself, it begins by King Abdullah calling attention to the unequal treatment that Palestinians are given compared to Zionist viewpoints at the time. Again, this is 1947, and Abdullah was calling attention to the fact that the mainstream news networks within the United States were virtually silent on Palestinian issues. They did not really at all amplify Palestinian voices. Instead, they really amplified Zionist ones, which is totally bizarre, because Zionist voices at the time weren't even part of a country. They weren't even part of a place that was theirs, unlike the Palestinians, who had been there for about 1,300 years. Now, at the time of writing this, in 1947, Abdullah is clear that 600,000 Zionist Jews had moved from Europe to Palestine, many of whom were forced to, who didn't actually want to, who viewed their homes as being in Europe, in Hungary, in Romania, in Germany, in England, in France, wherever, but who legitimately were experiencing extreme discrimination and persecution, largely because of colonialism, of European racism, were then forced to move out of Europe. That had to be in Palestine was actually somewhat coincidental. The first real Zionist figure, Theodor Herzl, in response to the Dreyfus Affair, did not think that it was necessarily going to be in Palestine. He suggested Argentina, Madagascar. There were even some echoes, some ideas of it happening in Canada. All of these places were essentially candidates for Jewish immigration away from the horrors that they were experiencing and legitimately experiencing in Europe, and had been for more than 1,000 years. Now, at the time, 600,000 Zionist Jews from Europe had moved to Palestine, and he is clear his issue is not with these people being there. This essay is his call for them to stop this immigration at this point in 1947 because it was growing untenable for the native inhabitants of that land to actually accommodate all of these people. In fact, he says that if we use a proportionate measure, it would be like if over 20 years in the United States at the time, between 1927 and 1947, if 45 million people had entered the US with the belief that it was their land. And now, whatever your views are on immigration broadly, to be able to accommodate 45 million people in the US would be a very difficult task. And the point is not to necessarily eschew that possibility, but Abdullah is instead saying, how would Americans respond? And the Palestinians have the exact same response, and they have been acting in that same response for 100 years. And he emphasizes, he is so clear that the issue for him is not that they are Jewish people. He says they could have been anyone. They could have been Spanish people. They could have been Portuguese people. They could have been Canadians. It doesn't matter. He's like, there's just way too many people showing up with the belief that this is their land, stealing that land from Palestinians, dispossessing Palestinians of their homes, murdering Palestinians in a lot of cases, as with the terrorist organizations Irgun, Lehi, and others, that were guided by a firm desire to rid the land of Palestinians, to prime it for Jewish immigration so they could sell the world the idea that it was an empty land. It was just waiting for the Jews to ostensibly return, as though they have more of a claim to it than the people living there, as though a Jewish person born in New York has more of a claim to that land than a Palestinian born there in the early 20th century. Like, explain that to me. Make that make sense. And when Palestinians put up any amount of resistance to this huge influx of immigrants into their country, intent on taking that country, when they put up any kind of resistance, they're branded as anti-Semites. But Abdullah is clear that anti-Semitism is not a Middle Eastern phenomenon. That is, in the way it has historically been the most violent. It is actually a European one. European anti-Semitism has been the most virulent, vile, reprehensible form of anti-Semitism, yet it is the Palestinians and neighboring Arab nations that get branded as the ultimate anti-Semites. We all know Netanyahu taking to the stage and saying that Hitler did not want to kill the Jews. It was only when he spoke with a Palestinian did he decide that the best thing to do would be to implement the final solution. What kind of whitewashing of the evil of Hitler is that the leader of Israel is prepared to entertain? What does that tell us about the Zionist imagination and the one that Netanyahu is so committed to expanding, so committed to making sure that state, that land is primarily Jewish? And we can just put forward this thought experiment. If Israel is really the only true democracy in the Middle East, as mainstream news outlets love to claim, then it should be fathomable that a Palestinian would then run that country. And if you're listening to this and you think, oh yeah, that'd be great, good for you. If you're listening to this and you think, no, that'll never happen, an Arabic Muslim Palestinian overseeing the land of Israel. Let's see. It's a democracy, right? That should be able to happen. And indeed, if we actually look at the history, there is no reason that shouldn't happen. Arabs and Jews have been living on that land for thousands of years harmoniously together. Of course, there are conflicts. There are conflicts in any part of the world, and it would be wrong to amplify them to make a broader statement about a hostility between these people, because that would be an over-exaggeration that would actually not encapsulate the reality of the situation. Again, Jews experience the most violence and harm, if we don't consider Egypt thousands of years ago, most violence and harm within Europe, in Nazi Germany, and in the neighboring states that supported Germany's Nazi policies in concentrating and implementing the final solution against Jews. And he's clear that it wasn't just Palestinians that were concerned about this influx of European Jewish immigration to that land. Native Jews to that land were also not super thrilled about it either, because it meant that people who didn't share the same cultural values and heritages, even all of those Jews who were coming to Palestine to flee persecution, possible violence, anti-Semitism in Europe, were not a homogenous group with a singular identity. These were a vastly heterogeneous group of people that were moving to a land that many of its indigenous inhabitants just weren't prepared to accommodate, even the Jewish ones. They weren't in a situation to actually accommodate this. And it's very interesting to note the representation in Israeli political history of Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi Jews, how they have each individually held, these groups have held different political power within Israel, and how those Jews from Europe have held disproportionate power in Israeli politics. Now he gets into the history of Jewish movement, specifically looking at the different periods that Jewish people occupied that land and called it their homes, because Jewish people have been living there for thousands of years indeed. Now from 1700 BCE, they moved from Spain, from other regions north of where is now Palestine and Israel, down into that region and into Egypt. In 1300 BCE, they left Egypt to flee persecution, to flee the violence, enslavement that they were experiencing. And then by about 1000 BCE, under the rule of David and then Solomon, they held that land. It was their own around Palestine. And then by 750 BCE, they only held a small piece of land, Judah, around Jerusalem. And then in 63 BCE, the Romans took it over, eventually ridding that land of Jewish people, a sign of the historical persecution and violence inflicted against Jews, which is very real, and then finally having them completely moved out by 135 AD or so. Now, give or take a few years. And then it would only be about 500 years later that Arabs would begin to occupy that land, going to show that it wasn't them that kicked out the Jews, it was the Romans. And then eventually the Muslim empires would take over that land and then settle there. Now, given all this, I mean, these are all histories of colonialism too, and they shouldn't be ignored. Like, for Jewish people to have been living there and then to have been kicked out thousands of years ago is horrible. Like, and at the time, all of us would have been standing up against that horrible, horrible treatment of Jewish people, and as indeed we should be. Just like we should stand up for any kind of injustice that any group of people experience at the hand of colonizers. But if we really listen to the Zionist credo, that is that because 1,000 years ago, more than 1,000 years ago, Jewish people once lived on that land, and that therefore they somehow have more of a right to it than the people currently living there, Abdullah asks us to just apply the same logic to every other scenario. People in Mexico should be allowed to return to Texas, maybe put them under occupation in Texas, because that's what Israel is currently doing to Palestinians. Zionists should also be in support of Arabs returning to Spain. I'm sure that they would love that, even though Spain is very much on the side, more or less, of the Palestinian struggle. Now, in any case, the point is that the Zionist dream should not get privilege over all of these other ones, and we should be able to call attention to the horrors that it is inflicting against the Palestinian people and has been for 100 years, and that just in the last 7 to 8 months, just the unspeakable horrors that Palestinians have been living through at the hands of the Israeli regime that can't be ignored, and it must end. Like, there's just no other way to do this. It has to end. And he really, his big gambit is to say that, well, if it is a matter of people having whoever lived there first, Christian Arabs should be able to return to that land too. And Arabs who lived there 500 years ago should be able to return to that land. Why is it just that Jews who occupied that land through one slice of history now get to justify occupying Palestinian territory, murdering Palestinians, dispossessing them of their land, all in the name of them having lived there once, living for over many years, 1,000 years ago? It doesn't compute. So what we're seeing is Palestinian suffering for the horrors that Europeans inflicted on Jewish people. And this should beg the question, and this is something that everybody should know of, why weren't Jews welcomed into the US after World War II? I mean, the US was very much willing to participate in the Zionist project to dispossess Palestinians of their land, homes, territory, murdering them, very much on the side of the Zionists in these efforts. But the US was suspiciously restrictive on Jews moving from Europe to the US. And Abdullah's like, well, if the US really cared about Jews, they would be willing to open up their borders. And that's exactly what he's calling for. He's saying at this point, 600,000 European Jews have moved to this land, as though 45 million people had moved to the US if we use it proportionally or think about it proportionally. And all he's saying is like, these people can stay. The point is for him that the rest of the people at least get asked where they want to go. And if they want to go to the US should accommodate them. If they want to go to Finland, Finland should accommodate them. If they want to go to Denmark, Denmark should accommodate them, because they all feel this collective guilt for the Holocaust and for anti-Semitism broadly. But they weren't interested in doing that. And Abdullah is like, look at how anti-Semitism is still very much present today, where the United States wasn't even willing to accept Jews. They put strict regulations in to limit Jewish immigration from Europe into the US after World War II. They would only let in a select number of Jews. So he's clear that European Jews underwent multiple violences, of course. But the latest one is that they weren't even asked where they wanted to go. They were just thrown toward Palestine and then meant to pick up the pieces of their Zionist leaders before them who wanted this dream to come true. Many of them didn't want to be there. And so they weren't being listened to. They weren't being cared for. And Abdullah is like, we need to care for them. Care for the ones that are already here and integrate them into Palestinian society, and then allow the rest of them who still have an option to go to other places. But they couldn't even do that. Many Jews who resisted the Zionist dream of moving to Palestine were physically assaulted. Many of them were killed within Palestine, many of whom wanted to leave. There were entire swaths of European Jews who, once they arrived in Palestine and things in Europe began to, simmer down as far as anti-Semitism goes, they wanted to move back. And they were stopped by the Zionist organizations at the time, and the British, who had still strict control over that land, stopped them from going back to their homes under threat of violence and persecution. Specifically, the way that the Jewish Agency in Palestine stopped tens of thousands of Jews who wanted to return home from returning home because they wanted to accomplish their Zionist project. Which is like, how can this happen in the name of Jews when Jews are victim to it? How is that, like, what? And if you want a great article on this, because I researched this a lot, Yuri Yedai wrote a really great article called Displaced in the National Home that you can find in Jewish Social Studies that looks at this history and how Jews are victim to Zionism in many different cases. You just open up your computer and you see Orthodox Jews being beaten to a pulp by Zionist figures who don't agree with them, like just anti-Semitism on full display. But, we see how this has been long in the making, this treatment of Jewish people at the hands of the Zionist dream. And so to conclude, he calls out America's support of the Zionist terrorist organizations that are very much recognized as terrorist organizations now, in the early days, even before World War II, that were dispossessing Palestinians of their land. He's calling out the American support of these organizations and also posing the question to everyday Americans, what would you do if 45 million people showed up on your shores saying that that land was theirs, which is like an unfathomable number of people? Like, there's no way to understand what that would be like. And the Palestinians have been living through it for 100 years. And Abdullah concludes his article by saying that whatever the American response, so too will the Palestinians have the same response, which just makes total sense. As soon as you put yourself in the shoes of Palestinians, I find it just so impossible to imagine not siding with them and not seeing this history of colonialism, this history of violence that Israel has been inflicting on them even before Israel was even in existence. And yeah, that pretty much encapsulates it. It's such an important historical document to understand just how long this issue has been going on, just how long Zionists have been victimizing Palestinians and Jews, and how this is not a new phenomenon. This has been well documented for over 100 years. And yeah, if you like what I did, consider donating to one of the organizations below. Consider getting involved in any way that you can, because this is something we really have to mount pressure over. And just to respond, I mean, one of the really common comments that I get is like, oh, well, why is this something that you care about so much? And these are clearly people who've never been on this channel before, because this is an issue, including myriad other ones, that I take extremely seriously. And it is just that now, immediately, we are seeing people get bombed every single day. Children, women, adults, men being incinerated, experiencing the worst violences, largely at the hands of our governments outside of Israel who are funding Israel. Our entire political media class that are responsible for cultivating and manufacturing consent for Israel's actions against Palestinians. And this has to be challenged. It has to be. And it's so funny when people say, oh, well, you never talked about this before, which isn't true. But it makes me think like, oh, well, in that case, no one can talk about anything ever, because you have to talk about it the first time in order to talk about it at all. And it is just a way by which to deflect and to draw attention away from the Israeli regime, to muddy the waters and to make sure that people use that as an excuse to focus on other things, like their careers, like their 2.3 kids, like their white picket fence, yada, yada, yada. But try to see through that, because as we move through time, we are going to find less and less attention being paid to the Palestinian struggle and the violences that are being inflicted on Palestinians. Moreover, because of the number of journalists that have been murdered by Israel, we are going to get less and less information out of Gaza about what people are going through. And this is why we have to really amplify this message. We have to make very sure that everybody is still paying attention to this issue and will continue to for the foreseeable future until Palestinians are free. And yeah, on that note, take care.